So this is a meme, but I don't think I've seen anybody really try to explain it. What the attraction is of anime and I guess kind of Japanese culture to people. I don't know if you want to call it the alt right, the dissident right, people in alternative political spheres. It's not just common among alt right people, it's common among, I guess you could call them alt left. Just kind of people who don't hold mainstream views. So, why is this other than the commonly accepted theory that these groups are dominated by autists and anime appeals to autistic people? Well, I think at the most basic level, it's because anime isn't particularly political, normative, or didactic. Unlike everything made in a Western country, 90% of the time if you're watching an anime, there's no obvious political agenda to it. Like if you watch like a Hollywood movie, it's always about gay rights or racial equality or tolerating differences or religion is bad or white people are bad or promoting race mixing or just like there's almost always a very obvious political agenda at play, even if it's not the focus of the movie. And it's not just that with movies, it's also true with video games. Like, BioWare used to be such a well-loved company because they didn't take political stances. They just focused on producing quality video games, quality stories, and relatable characters. While there was often political issues, they were kind of in the background and they were addressed in a very fair manner. Like, for example, Dragon Age Origins deals with religious issues, but I think it deals with it in a very fair way. There's good and bad people who's religious, there's good and bad people who aren't religious, and you're kind of presented with I guess you could say the pros and cons of each position. The Chantry isn't presented as being a generic evil organization. It's presented as an organization largely made up of people who are sincere in their beliefs, who want to do good, but who, like any organization, there's corrupt, self-serving members. So it's I think it was fair, and there's often political issues dealt with in old school BioWare, but I think they were dealt with a lot of class, and the game wasn't really, how would you put it, normative. Like, it's not trying to convince you of anything. And I think, like, when BioWare collapsed was when they abandoned neutrality, and they made things like Mass Effect Andromeda and Dragon Age 3, etc. And they abandoned storytelling or creating a good experience or having insight into the human condition, and instead just decided to make it entirely political. And I think to a certain extent that's probably ultimately what Gamergate was about, was this trend in Western society to abandon all traditional notions of storytelling and the idea that everything has to be political. And this is, I know I'm certainly guilty of it, but to be fair to me, my channel is explicitly for that purpose. I call them reactionary reviews. So if you want to say I make everything political, I do, but that's my stated purpose. My issue is more with people who claim that what they're doing is not political, when it very obviously is. Like, another good example of the need to make everything political is what happened with the NFL. Particularly when they had everybody wear pink constantly. Now you could say, well, breast cancer is not a political issue, but, well, it is a political issue. And it's, some people just want to watch a football game. They just want to watch football. They want to watch sports ball. And they have this stuff about needing to support breast cancer just shoved in their face. And they have all this other stuff, the people kneeling, etc. And this is kind of prominent through all the different sports. And I think that's the reason why a lot of them are losing so much of their viewership, is because people just want something entertaining. They want... That's not to say the entertainment can't be profound. That's not to say it can't say something about the human condition or it can't have a message. They just are tired of dealing with things that are overtly political. And they kind of want to break from it. And anime is not very political at all. I mean, there's some anime I would argue is more roughly right-wing. I know people are going to find this weird, but like Naruto I would say is more kind of right-wing. And then probably a lot of the yaoi and stuff is more, I guess you could say, kind of left-wing. But in general, because Japan has such a different political spectrum than North America, it's not very clear if it's different. Like, feminism just doesn't really seem to be as nearly as big a thing in Japan. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but it just doesn't seem to be expressed in nearly the same way. And as I've said before, a lot of things that seem like feminism are in part just kind of a reflection of the differences in Japanese society. Like in American movies, if there's like a woman warrior or something, it's very often like a raw feminism thing. Whereas in Japan, the idea of women, particularly of the upper class, having combat training is not really new. There were female samurai, there were female ninjas. Because Japan didn't have the same code of chivalry as Western Europe, it was important for upper class women in a lot of cases to be trained in using naganitas or yumis or other weapons to defend themselves if bandits or samurai attacked. So it's not necessarily kind of a modern revolutionary thing. It's kind of a reflection to a certain extent of something pre-existing. Which is to say, it's not kind of accompanied with the other baggage, etc. So if you look at Japanese stuff, if you have like Magical Girl or like Fire Emblem, like within Fire Emblem, most of the female characters who are knights or wizards or whatever get married, settle down, and have children after the war. It's kind of viewed as a temporary thing in many cases. So you don't have that kind of baggage. That's kind of like the first example. Other examples would be in the way homosexuality is dealt with. I can't really think of an anime that is normatively promotes it as a preferred lifestyle. It's not something I really see. I don't think it's something that would occur to them. Whenever it's used in an anime, it's normally just part of the story. It's kind of an organic part of the story. Like, it might be a running joke. Like, if you see Nodame, I forget his name, but the drummer has a crush on Chiaki, and it's just kind of played for laughs. It's kind of a running joke. They're not trying to promote a particular political or sexual agenda. It's just kind of an organic part of the story. Or if it's like Kenji in Persona 4, who kind of has those inclinations, it's dealt with in kind of a very neutral... I don't know if you want to say fair, but it's not trying to promote it. It's a story about a teenager who's going through some identity issues. It's not like an attempt like Gone Home or something that's attempting to force a particular point of view. On the topic of Persona, another kind of good example is the supposed transgenderism of Naoto. Now, a lot of Westerners have tried to impose the idea that Naoto in Persona 4 is a transsexual. I see absolutely no evidence of that. She simply... I have a character profile of her I'll put up at some point. But basically the thing is, it's a logical part of her character. She was born a girl into a very patriarchal society. And I don't mean that as a bad thing, I mean that as a descriptive. And she's entering probably one of the most patriarchal fields, which is police work. And she's from, I always think of her family as being old nobility. So you have this girl from a patriarchal society entering a very kind of male-dominated traditional industry, and she kind of has this struggle to be taken seriously, not just because of her age, but because of her gender. And because of that, it's kind of triggered a need for her to try to act as masculine and androgynous as possible to kind of hide her gender and a subconscious desire to be male. Now, this doesn't really seem to come from any sort of, I don't know what you call it, body dimorphism or kind of deep-set mental illness. It's just a natural response to a situation. It also has to do with just being confused. Like, teenagers have a lot of hormones. They're crazy. They undergo confusion. It's not necessarily an indication of anything beyond that. And to a large extent, I find in anime and Japanese video games, they just don't read into these things any deeper. If it exists, it's part of a story they're trying to tell. They aren't trying to change society. And I think that to a certain extent comes from the fact that Japan is a lot more culturally confident and monolithic than Western countries are. They've basically, with two exceptions, had the same party in power for the entirety of post-war Japan. I understand there used to be the Liberal and Democratic Party, and then they merged. But I think they were also similar to the pre-war party. I forget what the pre-war party is. I know there was the Imperial Rule Assistance Association during World War II, but there was kind of a liberal conservative semi-nationalist party before World War II and during the Meiji era. So they pretty much had political parties with more or less the same ideology for most of their existence. And in recent years, that has become even more dominant. Kind of this right-wing, conservative, somewhat collectivist, nationalistic political system, to the point where if you watch anime, they won't even refer to parties by name. They'll just call it the government and the opposition, because the Liberal Democrats are always in power, so it's just kind of, they're directly associated with the Japanese state. So, like I said, there's not these questions aren't that prevalent in Japanese society. Some, I guess you could say, kind of far left anime might push some of these issues about accepting immigration, but it's very, very rare. And it's very rare to really see something come out of Japan that fundamentally questions Japanese identity. There's a lot of cultural confidence there, etc. There's just not that much self-hatred. There's also a portrayal of Western societies. Some might say it's, I don't know, what's the opposite of Orientalism? Occidentalism, I guess. A kind of reverse fetishization of Western societies, where I always like to joke that Nintendo's the most pro-white company on Earth, because you look at it, most of their characters are like Aryan goddesses. Like you have Link, you have Zelda, you have Peach, you have Samus, you have Rosalina, you have all these, you have every character in every Fire Emblem game. And then you have stuff like Castlevania, which celebrates kind of Catholicism in medieval Europe to a degree that you just don't see in the West. You see these things that kind of celebrate, idealize, etc., and make Western things look cool in a way that you don't see within the West. I think that's part of the appeal, is to live vicariously your own culture through the eyes of the Japanese. Because they ironically have a much higher, at least from their media, a much higher opinion of Western cultures than the actual Western peoples themselves do. So those are, like, I think a couple of it. There's also just a lot of kind of traditional ideas, like gender roles, that are just not very controversial in Japan. Like, if you look at anime, the idea of the girl making the guy lunch is very common. It's not seen as like an oppressive patriarchal thing. It's very widespread, and no one really seems to be bothered by it. Like, I remember if you watch Girls in Panzer, they talk about how tankery will help their feminine graces and make them better wives and mothers. So you just kind of have this. It's just a lot of social issues are just not as widespread in Japan. I haven't seen a particularly wide push for gay marriage. I don't think I've even seen it presented in any anime. I'm sure there's some exceptions for it. Now, I know there's a lot of bad things about Japan, be it tentacle porn, weird shit involving panties, subway groping, etc. But Western societies have, like, standard fuck party and love is love with adding the P into LGBTQ, etc. So it's not as if their degenerate aspects are as bad as ours. If anything, they have them, but they're kind of tacked on to a society that's otherwise in a lot of ways more conservative. And I think that's kind of the appeal, is you have a focus. Like, you can like or dislike the way anime works, and there's very good arguments for it and against it. People can say the endings suck, the character motivations don't really make sense. There's a very deep ignorance towards history of other countries. There's a jingoism that denies everything Japan did during World War II. There's a lot of negative things to say about it. But I think you have to admit that there's more of a focus on just storytelling. And a lot of other stuff is just kind of more wholesome. There's kind of like I said, there's just an embracement of kind of an off the cases, things just being wholesome for the case of wholesomeness, without kind of a lot of the pedophilic necessarily undertones. I know that's weird talking about Japan, but you see in the rest of the world. Like, one of the reasons why Persona 4, I think, is such a big game is because it's so wholesome. It's a bunch of, like, nice high school kids kind of being friends, hanging out together, solving mysteries. It's just something you don't really see that much anymore. And that's also the reason why I think My Little Pony became so big, was because, once again, it's a non-political show that focuses on storytelling, developing characters, and humor, as opposed to trying to push any particular message. Like, I don't find it particularly feminist or anything. So I think that's the reason why Japanese culture appeals to people, is because ultimately people want entertainment, and if your own entertainment is telling you you suck constantly, you're going to look elsewhere. So I hope that was kind of an interesting video, and I'll talk to you guys later.